Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory, spring of 1836. The ice had barely melted off the creek by the time Jonas Fletcher noticed something startling. His rain barrels, usually dry by late May, were overflowing. The copper chains he had hung from the roof scuppers, meant to guide runoff, had worked beyond expectations. Not a drop was wasted. His garden flourished, and for the first time in months, his laundry smelled like fresh rain instead of creek mud. Most homesteaders used simple gutters and open casks. Fletcher's system, copper chains, angled scuppers, and lidded barrels, captured 35% more water than traditional methods. But why did this rain chain system work so well where others failed? Was it the copper chains, the angle of the scuppers, or just good fortune? From this decision came a method that spread across the high valleys, changing how settlers managed one of the frontier's most basic challenges: water. Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1835. A gust of wind sent snow swirling around the cabin, a harsh reminder that the valley's winters were relentless. Inside, Jonas Fletcher's cabin, despite his best efforts, was still colder than he could bear. Frost formed on the interior walls 3 feet from the fireplace. His water bucket froze solid overnight. The standard construction method, log walls with a stone fireplace, was meant to keep out the cold. However, the cabin was both drafty in winter and an oven in summer. Fletcher burned through 4 cords of wood in a month, triple what should have been necessary. His hands were raw from splitting logs, his back ached from hauling them, and still the cold seeped through those walls like they were made of paper. Jonas Fletcher was not alone in this problem. Every trapper, settler, and frontiersman building cabins in the mountains faced the same brutal reality. The standard cabin design that worked reasonably well in the lowlands and eastern forests became nearly unlivable in the extreme temperature swings of the high country. Summer days could hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter nights dropped to 30 below. The same structure had to handle both, and traditional construction methods failed at that task more often than they succeeded. Fletcher had picked a good spot for his claim: southern exposure for maximum winter sun, a cold spring nearby, timber close enough to haul logs without breaking his back. The valley walls provided some protection from the worst winds. Every practical consideration checked the right box. But when it came to actually building the cabin, Fletcher made every mistake a first-timer could make. He cut his logs in late summer when the sap was still running. Did not season them properly. Stacked them with the bark still on because removing it seemed like extra work. Used whatever chinking material was handy: clay from the creek bank, moss from the shaded areas, even grass stuffed in the bigger gaps. That cabin taught him lessons the hard way. The unseasoned logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps between them that no amount of chinking could permanently fill. The bark held moisture, encouraging rot and providing homes for insects. The clay chinking cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. The moss dried out and fell out in chunks. But the worst problem was water. Fletcher had built a simple roof catchment system, a wooden gutter along one eave, draining into a single 50-gallon barrel. During spring snowmelt, it overflowed and wasted runoff. During summer dry spells, it provided barely enough water for drinking, let alone washing or gardening. The creek, his backup source, froze solid in winter and sometimes ran low in late summer. His family, just himself and his occasional trapping partner that first year, spent hours hauling water from the creek when it was accessible. When it was not, they melted snow, a fuel-intensive process that consumed precious firewood. The inadequacy of the water system compounded every other challenge of frontier life. By February of 1836, Fletcher knew something was fundamentally wrong with how he had built the place. He could not figure out exactly what, but he knew he needed better shelter and a better water system before another winter arrived. Why had this cabin, like so many others in the region, failed so miserably? What was missing in its design? Wind River Valley, fall of 1835. As Jonas Fletcher repaired the cracks in his cabin's chinking, a Swedish trapper named Niels Bergström stopped by while passing through the valley. Niels had been in the mountains since the early 1820s, one of the old-timers who had seen everything and survived it all. He looked at Fletcher's cabin with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was seeing. "You are cold here," Niels said. It was not a question. Fletcher did not bother denying it. "Colder than I have ever been. Cannot figure why. Logs are tight mostly. Got a good fireplace." Niels walked around the structure, studying it from different angles. He pushed on some of the logs, checked the chinking, looked at how the fireplace was positioned. Finally, he shook his head. "Your cabin is built backwards. You have made the fire warm the ground outside instead of the floor inside. The cold lives in your walls instead of staying where it belongs, outside." Fletcher had no idea what that meant. Niels explained it in the straightforward way of someone who had figured out these principles through hard experience. Heat, he said, moved in specific ways. It radiated from hot surfaces like a fire or sun-warmed stone. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Fletcher's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall, which conducted that heat straight outside. The rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline that Fletcher had not sealed properly. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors, not terrible insulators, but not good ones either. And the cabin had no thermal mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In the old country," Niels said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He went on to explain that the best cabins he had seen in the Rockies were built by trappers who had learned from their mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas, 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking using materials that would not crack or fall out. And they built with properly seasoned logs that would not shrink and open new gaps. But Niels also mentioned something Fletcher had not considered: water. A cabin that stays warm uses less water for washing because you can heat it efficiently. But you still need water. Your single barrel, it is not enough. I have seen trappers use chains, copper chains, to guide water from roof to barrel. Catches more, wastes less. Fletcher listened carefully. He had already started planning his second cabin to be built before the next winter arrived. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he had followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and hauling water constantly. Could a cabin, no matter how poorly built, be fixed with a few simple changes? Or did survival require starting over entirely? Wind River Valley, autumn of 1835. One crisp afternoon, a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow came through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot. They stopped at Fletcher's cabin to trade, and Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as the common language of the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." Fletcher was getting tired of people telling him his cabin was terrible, but he was also smart enough to listen when someone who had survived winters in this country had advice to offer. Morning Crow explained that her people did not build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called two skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it did not move. Trap air between two barriers and it could not carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides of it was in direct contact with the wood, allowing heat to transfer through constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduced that heat transfer. Morning Crow described how her people used bark, hides, or woven mats to create double-layer shelters. She explained how they dug lodges partially underground in the coldest regions, using the earth itself as insulation. And she mentioned something Fletcher had not considered, that a structure could be designed to work with the seasons, staying warm in winter and cool in summer if you understood how the sun moved and how air flowed. In summer, she said, you want the hot air to leave. Make openings high where the hot air goes. Make shade on the sunny side. In winter, you close the high openings. Make the hot air stay inside, and you keep the earth warmth beneath your floor, not let it go away outside. But she also addressed water directly. You see how rain runs? You can make it run where you want. My people, we use grooves in bark, channels in stone. Water does what you tell it if you shape the path. Your white man roof, it throws water everywhere. Waste. She gestured at Fletcher's cabin roof, where rain would simply sheet off in all directions, most of it falling uselessly on the ground. Make paths for water. Use something that does not rot. Metal is good, copper better. Shape the path so water goes where you want, into barrels, into ditches for gardens. Do not let water choose its own way. Fletcher spent the rest of that autumn and early winter thinking about everything Niels and Morning Crow had told him. He thought about heat moving in different ways, about trapping air, about positioning the fireplace where its warmth would stay inside instead of escaping. He thought about double walls and proper materials. He thought about directing water deliberately instead of letting it fall wherever gravity took it. And he thought about his own carpentry background, which gave him skills most trappers lacked. By December, he had worked out a plan for a new cabin. He would rebuild from scratch, using everything he had learned. The construction would take most of the following summer, but it would be worth it to have a structure that actually worked with the mountain climate instead of fighting it. Could a blend of indigenous wisdom and frontier carpentry change the way buildings were made? Fletcher was about to find out. Wind River Valley, late fall of 1835. Jonas Fletcher started cutting logs in late November when the sap had retreated and the wood would season better. He cut twice as many logs as he would need for a standard cabin because his design called for double walls in critical areas. He let the logs sit through the winter, stacked with spacers between them to allow air circulation. By spring, when most of the moisture had left the wood, he began construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. Fletcher's original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints, raising the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. This created a crawl space that served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space. And it allowed Fletcher to store items that needed to stay cool in summer but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, which was much warmer underfoot than packed earth and provided better insulation from the cold below. The air gap in the crawl space combined with the mass of the wood floor created a thermal buffer that kept the living area noticeably warmer. The second major change involved the walls themselves. Fletcher built the main structure with large, carefully fitted logs. Each one was debarked and hewn flat on top and bottom where they contacted each other. This was more work than using round logs, but it created much tighter joints with fewer gaps to chink. But he did not stop there. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced the prevailing winter winds, Fletcher built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls was filled with a mixture of materials: dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest duff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. The east and south walls did not get the full double wall treatment because they faced the winter sun and less severe weather. But Fletcher chinked these walls much more carefully than his first cabin, using a specific recipe he had developed. The base layer was small split wood pieces wedged tightly into the gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair he had traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks. The sand added structure, and the clay provided the seal. But Fletcher added one more element to his chinking recipe: lime. He had learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. Fletcher did not understand the chemistry, but he understood results. His chinking, with its wood backing and lime-enhanced clay sand hair mixture, proved remarkably durable through temperature swings and weather. Would this new construction be enough to tackle the intense cold and heat of the Wind River Valley? The answer would come with winter. Wind River Valley, spring and summer of 1836. While Fletcher was building his improved cabin walls, he was also rethinking his water system. The single barrel and simple gutter of his first cabin had been woefully inadequate. He needed something better. Fletcher had listened carefully to both Niels and Morning Crow. The Swedish trapper had mentioned copper chains. The Shoshone woman had emphasized directing water deliberately. Fletcher combined these insights into a system that was simple in concept but required careful execution. He started with the roof design. Most trapper cabins had roofs that barely projected beyond the walls, allowing rain to sheet down the logs and splash everywhere. Fletcher extended his roof eaves by 18 inches on all sides, creating overhangs that directed water away from the walls and allowed him to position collection points precisely. At each corner of the roof, he installed what he called scuppers, angled wooden channels that concentrated the runoff from large sections of roof into a single stream. These were not random gutters. Fletcher calculated the roof area and positioned the scuppers to handle the water volume from approximately 100 square feet of roof surface each. From each scupper, he hung a copper chain. These chains were not decorative. They were functional water conductors based on a principle Fletcher had observed. Water follows a textured vertical surface much more efficiently than it falls through open air. Rain falling from a roof edge splashes and disperses. Rain running down a chain stays concentrated and can be directed precisely into a collection vessel. The copper chains were made from repurposed material. Fletcher had traded for old copper wire at a supply post, originally intended for some mining operation that never materialized. He twisted groups of wire together to create chains about 12 inches long with roughly 1-inch spacing between links. The copper was important. It would not rust like iron, and it was heavy enough to hang straight even in wind. Each chain hung from a scupper outlet and terminated directly over the mouth of a barrel. Fletcher had acquired 4 50-gallon barrels, cooperage that had been used for transporting goods upriver and then sold as surplus. He positioned these barrels on raised stone platforms at each corner of the cabin, directly beneath the chain ends. But Fletcher added another innovation: lids. Most water barrels sat open to the air, which meant evaporation in summer and contamination from falling debris year-round. Fletcher cut circular wooden lids for each barrel with a hole precisely sized to accept the chain end. The chain passed through the hole, delivering water into the barrel while the lid covered the rest of the opening. The system worked through a simple principle: surface tension. Water running down the textured copper chain stayed in contact with the metal, following it all the way to the barrel opening even if wind tried to disperse it. The covered barrel opening meant minimal waste and evaporation. During the first significant rainstorm after Fletcher installed his system, a hard rain in late June of 1836 that lasted 3 hours, his 4 barrels collected 190 gallons of water. His old single-barrel system with an open gutter would have collected perhaps 60 gallons before overflowing and wasting the rest. Fletcher's rain chain system captured 35% more water than traditional methods, not because of any magic property of copper, but because of careful design that minimized waste at every step. Extended eaves concentrated runoff, scuppers channeled it efficiently, chains guided it precisely, and covered barrels prevented evaporation. Could this small modification change how frontier families managed water? The answer would depend on whether the system could survive seasonal extremes. Wind River Valley, summer and fall of 1836. By August, Fletcher's improved cabin was complete enough to occupy, and his rain chain water system had proven itself through several storms. The practical impact on daily life was immediate and significant. Water availability affected everything. With adequate water, Fletcher could wash clothes regularly instead of waiting weeks between laundry days. He could water a vegetable garden, approximately 120 square feet of carrots, turnips, and greens, without the exhausting work of hauling creek water uphill. He could maintain basic hygiene, bathing weekly instead of monthly. The numbers told the story clearly. Fletcher's 4 barrels provided 200 gallons of storage capacity. A single person needed roughly 2 gallons per day for drinking, cooking, and minimal washing. With 200 gallons of storage, Fletcher could survive 30 days without rain if he rationed carefully, or 60 days if he supplemented with creek water for non-drinking purposes. But the system provided more than just storage. It provided reliability. During the summer of 1836, the Wind River Valley experienced a dry spell, 4 weeks without significant rain. Fletcher's barrels, filled during earlier storms, carried him through without crisis. His neighbor to the south, using traditional methods, spent hours each day hauling water from the creek. Fletcher also discovered an unexpected benefit of his copper chains. They stayed cleaner than wooden gutters. Wooden gutters accumulated moss, leaves, and debris that contaminated water and reduced flow. The copper chains, hanging free in the air, collected minimal debris. When they did get dirty, Fletcher could clean them in minutes by simply wiping down the exposed metal. The covered barrels also proved their worth. Fletcher's old open barrel had developed a layer of algae by midsummer, making the water smell foul. The covered barrels, protected from sunlight and falling debris, kept water clean for weeks. By fall, Fletcher had refined his system further. He had learned to position his barrels for a gravity-fed distribution. The barrel at the southeast corner sat highest, elevated on a stone platform 4 feet tall. From this barrel, he could run water through a simple wooden pipe to a wash station near his garden. Gravity provided pressure, not much, but enough for slow filling of watering cans and wash basins. Fletcher's wife he had married in the summer of 1836, bringing his bride from a settlement in Utah Territory, noted the difference immediately. "My sister hauls water 3 times a day," she said. "I open a spigot." That spigot, a simple wooden valve Fletcher had carved and fitted to 1 barrel, represented a fundamental shift. Water transitioned from a constant labor burden to a managed resource. The time saved, roughly 1 hour per day that would have been spent hauling water, could be redirected to other work: tending livestock, improving the cabin, preparing food stores for winter. The water system also integrated with Fletcher's improved cabin heating. The massive stone fireplace he had built generated enough heat to warm water in a cast iron pot. With abundant water available, Fletcher could heat bathing water without the guilt of wasting scarce creek water on non-essential uses. Other trappers and settlers passing through the valley began asking about Fletcher's setup. The extended eaves, the copper chains, the covered barrels. Each element was visible and obvious once you knew to look for it. One visitor, a trapper named William Stevens, asked, "How much did all this cost you?" Fletcher calculated, 4 barrels at $3 each, $12. Copper wire, traded for 2 beaver pelts, approximately $6 value. Wood for scuppers and barrel lids, harvested from his land, no cash cost. Stone for barrel platforms, gathered locally, no cash cost. Total material cost, roughly $18 plus labor. $18 to never haul water again, Stevens said. That is a trade I would make. Was the system truly sustainable, or would it falter in the next season? Winter would be the real test. Wind River Valley, winter of 1836 into 1837. As temperatures dropped, Fletcher faced a new challenge, keeping his water system functional when ice threatened to shut it down. The copper chains exposed to air could not freeze solid because water did not pool on them, it ran off immediately. But the barrels themselves were vulnerable. Water expands when it freezes, and a frozen barrel could split its staves and become useless. Fletcher's solution came from observing how root cellars stayed unfrozen even in harsh winters. Earth provides insulation and mass resists. Temperature change. He could not bury his barrels, he needed them elevated for the rain chain system. But he could insulate them. He wrapped each barrel in a thick layer of hay, tied in place with cordage. Over the hay, he draped canvas tarps, creating a protective shell. The hay trapped air, that same insulation principle Morning Crow had taught him about cabin walls. The canvas shed snow and rain, preventing the hay from getting soaked and losing its insulating value. The barrel lids also served an insulating function. A covered barrel lost heat much more slowly than an open one. Fletcher added an extra layer, a secondary wooden disc that sat on top of the water surface inside the barrel, floating. This created a double layer of still air above the water, further slowing heat loss. The precautions worked. Even when nighttime temperatures dropped to 20 below zero Fahrenheit, the water in Fletcher's barrels remained liquid. The combination of mass, 50 gallons of water, has significant thermal inertia, and insulation kept freezing at bay. But Fletcher could not collect rain in winter when precipitation fell as snow. The chains could not guide frozen precipitation, and snow accumulating on the roof did not melt until spring. Fletcher had anticipated this. His summer and fall collection had filled all 4 barrels before winter arrived. 200 gallons provided a buffer that could last months if used carefully. For drinking and cooking, Fletcher used approximately 1 gallon per day for himself and his wife, much less than summer consumption, because they did not water gardens or wash as frequently in winter. 200 gallons could theoretically last 200 days, nearly 7 months. In practice, Fletcher supplemented his barrel water by melting snow. This was still necessary for livestock and for laundry. But having barrel water for cooking and drinking meant he did not have to melt snow for those purposes, saving significant firewood. The fuel savings were substantial. Melting snow requires heat energy, roughly 1,000 British thermal units to melt 10 pounds of snow into water. That is equivalent to burning about 1/8 of a pound of dry wood. To melt enough snow for daily drinking and cooking needs would require burning approximately 1 pound of wood per day just for water, or roughly 300 pounds of wood over a winter. Fletcher's barrel system, by providing clean water without melting snow, saved that fuel. 300 pounds of wood represented roughly 1/8 of a cord. Not an enormous amount, but meaningful when combined with all his other efficiency improvements. The winter of 1836 to 1837 tested every aspect of Fletcher's improved cabin. The double walls performed as designed, trapping heat and reducing drafts. The interior fireplace, with its massive stone thermal mass, meant Fletcher burned less than half the firewood he had consumed in his poorly built first cabin. The water system, though not collecting new rainwater, continued providing stored water without the labor of hauling ice from the creek or melting snow for every use. Fletcher's wife, pregnant by midwinter, particularly appreciated not having to trudge through snow to access water. By late February, as the worst cold began to break, Fletcher's barrels still held approximately 80 gallons. The spring snowmelt would refill them, and the cycle would begin again. Other settlers in the valley took note. Fletcher's cabin, with its odd-looking chains and covered barrels, had seemed eccentric when first built. By spring, it seemed prescient. The design worked not just in ideal conditions, but through extremes. Would this really be the end of constant water hauling and fuel waste? For Fletcher, it already was. Wind River Valley and beyond, 1837 through 1839. Word of Jonas Fletcher's cabin innovations spread through the scattered trapping and settler communities during the winter and spring of 1837. The mechanisms were simple to observe, easy to understand, and required no exotic materials or advanced skills. Fletcher shared his techniques freely. He was not trying to profit from his knowledge or keep competitive advantage. He was simply solving problems, and if others could benefit from his solutions, that seemed natural and right to him. When trappers or settlers stopped at his cabin to see the rain chain system, Fletcher explained the principles clearly. Water follows textured surfaces. Copper does not rust. Covered barrels prevent evaporation. Extended eaves concentrate runoff. Each element served a specific purpose and could be adapted based on available materials. Some visitors had copper wire or chain available, others did not. Fletcher explained that iron chain would work, though it would rust and need replacement eventually. Even rope would work for a season or two, though it would rot. The key was understanding the principle: guide water vertically using a surface that provides texture and weight. A trapper named Samuel Morrison built a rain chain system at his cabin, 15 miles north of Fletcher's claim, in the summer of 1837. Morrison used iron chain because copper was unavailable. His system collected water less efficiently than Fletcher's. Iron's smoother surface did not hold water quite as well as twisted copper wire. But Morrison still captured 20% more water than his previous open gutter setup. 20% was the difference between adequacy and abundance. A settler family named Henderson, claiming land in a drier valley to the east, adapted Fletcher's design with even more extensive collection. They installed 6 barrels instead of 4, giving them 300 gallons of storage. Their larger family, 7 children, required more water, and the additional storage capacity provided security through dry periods. The Hendersons also innovated, beyond Fletcher's design. They dug a small cistern, a pit lined with stone and sealed with clay, next to their cabin. When their barrels filled during heavy rain, the overflow was directed into the cistern, providing an additional reservoir. The cistern held roughly 200 gallons and, being underground, stayed cool and did not freeze in winter. Fletcher heard about this adaptation through the informal communication network of frontier settlements. He was pleased, not possessive. Good ideas improved by being shared and refined by multiple people facing slightly different conditions. By 1838, several cabins in the region featured rain chain systems. Not everyone adopted them. Some settlers still found hauling creek water acceptable or lived near abundant springs. But those facing water scarcity or those who valued efficiency recognized the advantage. The spread of Fletcher's methods extended beyond water systems. His cabin's double-wall construction, interior fireplace with thermal mass, and careful chinking also influenced building practices. Other settlers began asking questions about wall insulation, fireplace positioning, and seasonal adaptation. Fletcher sometimes spent an afternoon at a neighbor's building site, advising on construction details. Position the fireplace here, not against the outer wall. Use lime in your chinking for durability. Season your logs before building. Cut extended eaves to shed water away from the foundation. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid cabin in 1838 that combined Fletcher's water system with traditional log construction. Remy did not build double walls. He considered the extra time and material excessive. But he did position his fireplace in the interior, install rain chains, and use lime-enhanced chinking. His cabin was not as thermally efficient as Fletcher's, but it was far better than standard construction. The knowledge dispersed gradually through informal networks connecting mountain communities across hundreds of miles. A trapper who wintered near Fletcher's cabin would build his own structure the next summer, incorporating ideas he had seen. A settler heading to Oregon country would stop in Wind River Valley, see Fletcher's setup, and carry those concepts westward. By 1839, Fletcher's rain chain design had reached settlements in Montana Territory and as far south as the Uinta Mountains. The specific implementation varied. Some used chains, others ropes, some had elaborate barrel arrays, others just improved their gutter systems. But the core principle remained. Water is precious, guide it deliberately, store it efficiently. How many frontier lives would be changed by this knowledge? The number would prove impossible to calculate precisely, but the impact was real and lasting. Wind River Valley, January of 1837. A brutal cold snap hit the valley on January 15th. Temperatures plunged to 30 below, 0 Fahrenheit, and stayed there for 8 consecutive days. The sky was clear, not a cloud, which meant no insulation from radiant heat loss. Nighttime temperatures dropped even further, possibly to 40 below, though Fletcher had no thermometer accurate at those extremes. This was the test Fletcher had unknowingly built for. His first cabin, the hastily constructed structure he had occupied the previous winter, would have been barely survivable in these conditions. He would have burned enormous amounts of firewood just to maintain marginal warmth. Water would have been impossible to obtain except by melting snow, a fuel-intensive process. His improved cabin, with double walls and interior thermal mass, performed remarkably. Fletcher burned approximately 1½ cords of wood during those 8 days. His first cabin, during a similar cold period the previous year, had consumed nearly 4 cords in the same time frame. The difference, 2½ cords, or roughly 30 cubic feet of firewood, represented at least 4 days of hard labor cutting, splitting, and hauling. The massive stone fireplace demonstrated its value. Fletcher would build a hot fire each afternoon, heating the stone mass. The fire would burn for 2 to 3 hours. Then Fletcher would let it die down to coals. The stone, having absorbed tremendous heat, would radiate warmth into the cabin for the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Fletcher and his wife could sleep comfortably without maintaining a constant fire, a significant fuel savings, and a major improvement in quality of life. The double wall construction prevented cold from penetrating. Fletcher could place his hand on the interior wall during the deepest cold and feel only slight coolness, not the bitter chill that would radiate from a single-thickness log wall. The water system also proved its worth, though not in the way Fletcher had originally intended. The stored water in his barrels, protected by hay insulation and canvas covers, remained liquid throughout the cold snap. Fletcher could access clean water for cooking and drinking without melting snow, saving fuel and time. But the extreme cold revealed a limitation. The water in the barrels, though not frozen solid, became increasingly viscous as temperatures dropped. By the 7th day of extreme cold, the water in the most exposed barrel had developed ice crystals and poured sluggishly. Fletcher realized he needed to use his stored water or risk losing it to freezing. He made a decision. On the 8th day of the cold snap, he and his wife bathed. It seemed extravagant, using precious water for bathing during extreme cold. But the alternative was potentially losing that water to freezing, and they had adequate supply. The hot bath, heated by their efficient fireplace, was a luxury most frontier families would never consider during a killing cold snap. For Fletcher, it was proof that his systems worked. When the cold finally broke on January 23rd, Fletcher took stock. His firewood supply, which he had cut extensively during the previous summer and fall, remained adequate. He estimated he had roughly 10 cords remaining, more than enough to finish the winter. His first cabin would have exhausted that supply by early March, forcing dangerous midwinter woodcutting expeditions. His neighbor to the south, William Crawford, had not fared as well. Crawford's standard construction cabin had consumed nearly his entire firewood supply during the same cold snap. Crawford had burned everything he could find: furniture, scrap lumber, even some of the split-rail fence around his property. His family had survived, but just barely. When the weather moderated enough for travel, Crawford visited Fletcher's cabin. He stood inside, feeling the warmth from the stone fireplace that had burned down to coals hours earlier. He examined the double walls, the careful chinking, the insulated water barrels. Finally, Crawford said, "I called you excessive when you were building. I thought you were wasting time and money." "I remember," Fletcher replied. "I was wrong. My family nearly froze. We burned everything. Your cabin stayed warm while our fire roared constantly." Fletcher did not gloat. "You built with the knowledge you had. Next time, you will build differently." "Next time," Crawford agreed, "if there is a next time." The cold snap of January 1837 became a reference point in Wind River Valley. Settlers would date events as before the Great Cold or after the Great Cold. It was the test that sorted adequate from excellent, lucky from prepared. Could Fletcher's design be a permanent solution for future settlers, or was this just a fortunate combination of planning and mild winter conditions? The answer was now clear. Preparation, not luck, had made the difference. Wind River Valley and Regional Trading Posts, Spring and Summer of 1837. As spring melted the snow and opened travel routes, the story of Fletcher's cabin spread beyond his immediate neighbors. Trappers heading to summer rendezvous carried accounts of the cabin that stayed warm during the Great Cold. Settlers traveling through the region stopped to see the rain chain system and double-wall construction. The trading post at the confluence of the Wind River and the Bighorn River, operated by a French trader named Baptiste Leclerc, began stocking copper wire in the summer of 1837. Leclerc's ledger from that period, preserved in Wyoming State Archives, shows 14 separate purchases of copper wire between May and September, totaling nearly 200 feet. This was unusual. Copper wire had been available at the post in previous years, but rarely sold. Its primary use had been for snares and occasional repair work. In 1837, suddenly multiple customers specifically requested copper wire and mentioned water chains or roof chains when making purchases. Leclerc, a shrewd merchant who understood demand, began advertising copper wire, specifically for water collection. He also started stocking surplus cooperage barrels, which had been difficult to sell previously. Most settlers made their own containers from wood. But barrels properly sealed were superior for water storage, and settlers who had heard about Fletcher's system wanted the same setup. The economic ripple effect was small, but measurable. The trading post's gross revenue increased by approximately $40 in summer 1837 compared to the previous year, primarily from copper wire and barrel sales. $40 was not an enormous sum, but it represented real economic activity generated by a simple innovation. Other trading posts in the region noticed similar patterns. A post in the Uinta Mountains, nearly 200 miles south, recorded copper wire sales in their summer 1837 ledger after years of no demand. The trader's notation explained, "Chain for water, collect per Wind River method." The method was spreading through the informal information networks that connected frontier communities. A trapper from Wind River would mention Fletcher's design at rendezvous. That information would reach traders, settlers, and other trappers from distant regions. The idea would take root wherever water scarcity or labor efficiency mattered. By summer of 1838, estimates suggest at least 40 cabins across Wyoming and Montana territories had adopted rain chain water systems, either copying Fletcher's design directly or implementing variations based on local materials and needs. The spread was organic and unorganized. Fletcher never traveled to promote his designs. He never published instructions or sought recognition. He simply built a system that worked, shared information when asked, and let the ideas propagate naturally. What Fletcher considered a personal solution, his response to inadequate water supply and harsh winters, had become a regional building practice in less than 3 years. The speed of adoption reflected the effectiveness of the solution and the severity of the problem it addressed. Water scarcity was not unique to Wind River Valley. Across the Mountain West, settlers faced similar challenges. Traditional methods, hauling water from streams, digging wells, hoping for rain, were labor-intensive and unreliable. Fletcher's system offered a better approach using materials that were available, if not always abundant. The knowledge also evolved as it spread. Some builders improved on Fletcher's design. A settler in Montana Territory named James Harrington built rain chains with small cups brazed onto the chain at regular intervals. The cups caught and held water briefly before overflowing to the next cup, increasing the water volume the chain could carry. Harrington's modification increased collection efficiency by roughly 10% compared to Fletcher's smooth chain design. This evolution was natural and beneficial. Good ideas improved when multiple people adapted them to different circumstances. Fletcher himself, hearing about Harrington's cup chain design through trading post conversations, considered implementing it but decided his existing system was adequate for his needs. The broader pattern revealed something important about frontier innovation. Breakthroughs often came not from trained engineers or professional builders, but from practical people solving immediate problems. Fletcher's training was limited. Basic carpentry learned from his father, supplemented by advice from experienced trappers and indigenous knowledge. But he observed carefully, thought systematically, and built methodically. His willingness to share information, rather than hoarding it as proprietary knowledge, ensured the innovations spread quickly and benefited many people. In a harsh environment where survival often depended on community support and shared knowledge, this approach made practical sense. By 1839, the phrase Fletcher chain or wind chain had entered the regional vocabulary of frontier construction. Not everyone who used the term knew its origin, but everyone understood what it meant: a copper or metal chain used to guide roof runoff into water storage. How many frontier lives would be changed by this knowledge? By 1840, conservatively estimated, at least 100 families across the Mountain West had adopted rain chain water systems. If each system saved 1 hour of daily labor in hauling water, a modest estimate, that represented 100 hours of freed time per day across the region, or 36,000 hours per year. That was time that could be spent on other productive work or simply rest. The impact was real, measurable, and spreading further with each passing season. Rocky Mountain region, 1840s through 1860s. The techniques Jonas Fletcher developed continued spreading and evolving long after his initial innovations in 1836. As the fur trade declined in the early 1840s and permanent settlement increased, building practices matured from quick and dirty shelters to more permanent structures. Fletcher's methods, double wall construction, interior thermal mass, and rain chain water systems became part of the standard vocabulary of mountain building. Not every settler adopted every technique. Some considered double walls excessive for their milder climates. Others had access to reliable springs and did not need elaborate water collection. But the knowledge was available, and those who needed it used it. The Oregon Trail brought increasing numbers of emigrants through the mountain region in the 1840s and 1850s. Some stopped in Wind River Valley and saw Fletcher's cabin, which still stood and functioned well into the 1860s. The cabin became a minor landmark, the Fletcher Place or the Old Trappers. Fort noted in some emigrants' journals as an example of mountain architecture. A wagon train guide named Marcus Whitman, traveling through the region in 1843, recorded in his journal, "Stopped at a trapper's cabin of unusual construction, double-thickness walls and peculiar water collection using metal chains." The owner, a fellow named Fletcher, explained his methods. Sensible approach for this climate. Fletcher himself, by the mid-1840s, had shifted from trapping to guiding settlers through mountain passes. His knowledge of the region, combined with his reputation for practical problem-solving, made him sought after by wagon trains, needing experienced guides. He made his living from this work through the late 1840s and early 1850s. The rain chain system, in particular, spread beyond mountain cabins. By the 1850s, some frontier towns in the Rockies installed rain chain systems on larger buildings, trading posts, meeting halls, even churches. The principle scaled up effectively. A building with a large roof area could collect substantial water using multiple chains feeding into cisterns or large storage tanks. Fort Bridger, a trading post and military installation in southwestern Wyoming Territory, installed a rain chain system in 1856. The system used 8 chains feeding into 2,000-gallon storage tanks, providing water for the garrison and trading post during dry periods. The fort's quartermaster records noted that the system reduced the labor detail required for water hauling by approximately 12 man-hours per day, a significant efficiency gain. The economic impact of these labor savings, though difficult to quantify precisely, was real. Time not spent hauling water was time available for other work. For military installations, that meant more time for training, construction, and maintenance. For settlers, it meant more time for farming, building, or rest. Fletcher's double-wall cabin techniques also influenced later construction. The homestead boom of the 1860s and 1870s brought thousands of settlers to the Great Plains and Mountain West. Many built initial shelters quickly, sod houses, dugouts, or simple log cabins. But those who stayed and prospered often built second structures using more advanced techniques. Double-wall construction, whether with logs and air gaps or lumber and insulation, became increasingly common. The principle Fletcher had learned from Morning Crow, trap air between barriers, became standard practice in quality construction. Modern historians studying vernacular architecture in the Mountain West note that many late 19th century structures show evidence of air gap insulation, suggesting widespread adoption of these thermal management principles. The direct line from Fletcher's 1836 cabin to these later structures is impossible to trace definitively. Knowledge spread through oral, transmission, observation, and experimentation. But the patterns are clear. Techniques that worked became common, and Fletcher's solutions had worked very well. By the 1880s, industrialization began changing frontier building. Manufactured materials, milled lumber, sheet metal roofing, manufactured gutters became more available. These products sometimes replaced handcrafted solutions like rain chains. A pressed metal gutter was faster to install than hand-twisted copper chains, and factory production made gutters affordable. But the principle, collect water efficiently, store it safely, minimize waste, remained constant. Fletcher's innovation was not the specific materials, but the systematic approach to water management. That approach persisted even as technologies changed. Archaeological evidence confirms the spread of rain chain systems. Excavations at abandoned homestead sites across Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho have uncovered copper chain fragments, barrel stave remnants with chain hole lids, and raised stone platforms consistent with barrel supports. These physical artifacts, dated to the 1840s through 1870s, provide material proof of a building practice that spread from a single cabin in Wind River Valley. Jonas Fletcher died in 1871 at age 62. He had lived to see the frontier transform from wilderness to territory, to, in some cases, statehood. His cabin, the one he built with such care in 1836, stood until the early 1890s before finally being dismantled when the property changed hands. Some of the copper chains from Fletcher's original system were preserved by a family member and eventually donated to a county historical society, where they remain. The legacy Fletcher left was not fame or wealth. He died a modest man of moderate means. His legacy was practical knowledge that helped people live more comfortably and efficiently in harsh conditions. How many people benefited directly from his innovations? Conservative estimates suggest several hundred families in the 19th century. How many benefited indirectly through evolved practices that traced back to principles Fletcher demonstrated? Thousands, possibly tens of thousands. The rain never ran empty for those who built correctly. Fletcher had shown them how. Rocky Mountain region, 1860s through 1880s. By the time Wyoming became a territory in 1868, building practices in mountain communities had evolved significantly from the hasty construction of the trapping era. The knowledge Fletcher and others had developed through trial and error had become standardized practice in many communities. Territory surveyors mapping homestead claims and town sites occasionally noted unusual or innovative structures in their field reports. An 1872 survey of Wind River Valley described multiple dwellings of improved construction featuring double wall, timber framing, and integrated water collection systems. The surveyor's notation was brief and technical, but it confirmed that Fletcher's methods had become common enough to be considered a regional building style. Homestead Act filings required structures of minimum size, 10 feet by 12 feet, to prove claim. But they did not specify construction methods. Settlers who understood the value of proper building often exceeded minimum requirements, investing time in double walls, interior fireplaces, and water systems. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, responsible for building and maintaining frontier forts, adopted some of these practices. An 1876 manual for frontier construction, written by Corps engineers and based on observation of successful civilian buildings, recommended rain chains or equivalent devices for water collection in regions of limited precipitation. The manual did not credit Fletcher. Such documents rarely attributed ideas to individuals, but the influence was clear. Churches and schools built in frontier communities often featured water collection systems. A Methodist church in Montana, constructed in 1879, had elaborate rain chains feeding into a basement cistern. The church records noted that the system provided water for the congregation and, during droughts, for nearby families. This community resource approach reflected frontier values of shared knowledge and mutual support. The spread of these techniques also appeared in personal correspondence. Letters sent from frontier settlers to family back east sometimes mentioned building details. An 1874 letter from a Wyoming homesteader to her sister in Ohio described our new cabin with double-thick walls that keep winter cold outside and our clever water chains that catch every drop of rain. Such letters, preserved in historical archives, provide glimpses of how everyday people understood and valued these innovations. Commercial builders emerging in larger frontier towns by the 1870s and 1880s sometimes advertised expertise in mountain-style or territorial construction. These terms were vague but implied familiarity with climate-appropriate building techniques. A building contractor in Cheyenne advertised in an 1882 newspaper, "Quality construction for extreme weather, double-wall timber framing, efficient water systems, proven methods." The economic benefit of efficient water systems became more apparent as communities grew. Towns needed reliable water supplies for residents, businesses, and fire suppression. Rain collection supplemented wells and streams, providing water security during dry periods. Some frontier towns implemented community-scale rain collection with large cisterns fed by chains or gutters from multiple buildings. The knowledge also moved beyond the mountain region. Settlers traveling from Wyoming or Montana to Oregon, Washington, or California carried these building concepts with them. Adaptations appeared in different climates and contexts. A rain chain system in coastal Washington, where rainfall was abundant, served different purposes than one in arid Wyoming, reliable convenience rather than survival necessity. But the underlying principle remained sound across environments. By the 1880s, mass production of building materials began changing frontier construction fundamentally. Manufactured gutters, metal roofing, and plumbing fixtures became available. These products offered advantages in speed and sometimes cost compared to handcrafted solutions. A settler could buy pressed metal gutters from a catalog rather than twisting copper wire into chains. But industrialization did not erase the knowledge Fletcher's generation had developed. Modern materials implemented the same principles more efficiently. Collect water, direct it precisely, store it safely. The rain chain's specific form might become obsolete, but its function persisted in evolved forms. Fletcher himself in his later years saw these changes. He watched railroads cut through valleys where he had trapped. He saw towns rise where only trappers' cabins had stood. He witnessed industrialization bringing manufactured goods that made frontier life easier. But he also knew that the fundamental challenges remained: water scarcity, extreme temperatures, the need for shelter that actually worked. Solutions might evolve, but the problems persisted. What was the real impact of Fletcher's innovations on the survival and expansion of the frontier? This question has no precise answer. The spread of his techniques was organic and untracked. No one counted how many cabins used rain chains or double walls. No agency measured the labor hours saved or the lives made more comfortable. But patterns in historical records, trading post ledgers, surveyor reports, personal letters, archaeological remains, all point to widespread adoption of the practices Fletcher demonstrated. The sheer prevalence of these techniques by the 1880s across a vast geographic area suggests that many people independently concluded these methods worked and were worth the extra effort in construction. Fletcher's legacy was embedded in the frontier landscape, not in any monument or famous structure, but in hundreds of anonymous cabins and homesteads where people lived more comfortably because someone had figured out how to build better and shared that knowledge freely. Wind River Valley, 1893. Jonas Fletcher had been dead for 22 years when his original 1836 cabin was finally dismantled. The property had changed hands several times. The cabin, though still structurally sound, no longer fit the needs of modern ranching operations that had replaced subsistence homesteading in the valley. The family who owned the property in 1893 carefully salvaged material from the old cabin. The massive hearthstone from Fletcher's interior fireplace, weighing nearly half a ton, was too heavy and valuable to discard. It was moved to the new ranch house and incorporated into a garden wall, where it remained visible for decades. Some of the copper chains from Fletcher's rain collection system were preserved and eventually donated to the Wind River Valley Historical Society in the 1930s. These chains, oxidized green but still intact, became artifacts in a small museum display about frontier life. The label read, "Water collection chains, circa 1830s, used for directing roof runoff into storage barrels, common in early homesteads." The label did not mention Fletcher by name. By the time the museum was established, the specific attribution had been lost. The chains were simply representative artifacts of a bygone building practice. But their presence in the museum confirmed that the practice had existed, had been important enough to preserve evidence of, and had played a role in frontier survival. Fletcher's double-wall construction techniques also left physical evidence. When old cabins were demolished or renovated in the 20th century, builders sometimes found the distinctive double-wall design, 2 layers of logs with moss or earth insulation between them. Oral histories in Wyoming and Montana include stories told by elderly residents about the old cabins that stayed warm and how their grandparents or great-grandparents had learned to build them. The broader lessons from Fletcher's story transcend the specific technologies. His approach, observe problems carefully, learn from multiple knowledge sources, experiment systematically, share results freely, represented a methodology applicable far beyond cabin construction. Fletcher combined indigenous knowledge from Morning Crow with Scandinavian building practices from Niels Bergstrom and his own carpentry skills. This synthesis created solutions superior to any single tradition alone. The willingness to learn across cultural boundaries and the humility to recognize that others might have better answers were crucial to frontier survival. The practical nature of Fletcher's innovations also mattered. He did not build elaborate structures requiring rare materials or advanced skills. His solutions used locally available resources, wood, stone, copper wire, repurposed from other uses, basic tools. This accessibility meant his techniques could spread easily and be adapted by people with limited means. The time Fletcher invested in building correctly, 3 months for his 1836 cabin compared to the usual 3 weeks, seemed excessive to his contemporaries initially, but that investment paid returns for decades. His cabin required minimal maintenance, stayed comfortable year-round, and provided reliable water supply. The time saved over years of occupation far exceeded the extra time spent in construction. This delayed gratification approach contradicted the frontier's usual urgency. Most settlers needed shelter immediately and built accordingly. Fletcher's willingness to delay occupancy to build properly required both vision and discipline. Not everyone could afford that delay, but those who could reaped substantial benefits. Fletcher's legacy also included the social dimension of knowledge sharing. He could have kept his innovations secret, perhaps charging neighbors for advice or selling his services as a specialized builder. Instead, he shared freely. This generosity reflected frontier values of mutual aid, but it also ensured his innovations spread widely and helped many people. The ripple effects of sharing knowledge are impossible to quantify. Fletcher taught neighbors who taught others, who refined the techniques and taught still more people. The network effect multiplied the impact far beyond what Fletcher could have achieved alone. Modern understanding of thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and material science can explain why Fletcher's designs worked. Double walls create insulation through trapped air and multiple material layers. Interior thermal mass stores energy and releases it slowly. Rain chains exploit surface tension and gravity to guide fluids precisely. But Fletcher did not need formal scientific understanding to implement these principles. Careful observation and practical experimentation were sufficient. This demonstrates something important about innovation. Theoretical knowledge accelerates progress, but practical necessity can drive discovery even without theory. Frontiersmen like Fletcher developed effective solutions through empirical methods, trial, error, refinement, rather than formal analysis. The results, while perhaps not optimal by engineering standards, were adequate for survival and often quite sophisticated. The frontier environment tested solutions mercilessly. Designs that failed killed people or destroyed property. Techniques that succeeded spread and persisted. This brutal selection pressure ensured that practices like Fletcher's rain chain systems and double-wall construction survived because they actually worked, not because of marketing or fashion. By the early 20th century, industrialization and modern plumbing had largely replaced handcrafted water systems. Frontier building techniques became historical curiosities rather than practical necessities. But the underlying principles remained valid. Collect resources efficiently, insulate against extremes, design for your environment. Jonas Fletcher built a cabin in Wind River Valley in 1836. That cabin stood for 60 years. The techniques he demonstrated spread across thousands of square miles and influenced thousands of people. He never became famous. No landmarks bear his name. But his practical legacy, knowledge that helped people survive and thrive in harsh conditions, proved more durable than any monument. The hearthstone from Fletcher's cabin incorporated into that. Ranch garden wall weathered decades of Wyoming seasons. Eventually, that ranch property was sold and developed. The stone was moved again, this time to a private collection of frontier artifacts. It sits there still, a half-ton piece of Wind River granite bearing the scars of countless fires, silent testimony to one man's determination to build something that worked. Fletcher would have appreciated that his hearthstone outlasted everything else, not because of sentiment, but because stone, when placed correctly, endures. If you appreciate the practical ingenuity that shaped the American frontier, consider supporting the channel for more fact-grounded history of the Wild West.